So I met a guy on Tinder and we really started to hit it off. We'd been chatting for a few weeks and even discovered that we had mutual friends. I was pretty intoxicated one night, was feeling social, and decided to call an Uber to his place. Once I got there, we talked outside for a while and ended up vibing even better in person. I opened up to him about my health problems, and he opened up to me about his older sister who had passed away from a similar condition to mine. I was curious about his sister, but I definitely didn't want to pry. Anyway, we walked into his house, and as soon as I walked in, it smelled like a 1,000 dead rats were just rotting under the floorboards. I was still pretty drunk, so I tried to forgive it because, hey, sometimes animals just die under your house or in the walls, and there's nothing you can really do about it, right? I start to look around, and the whole house looks like a cluttered storage unit, and he takes me to his room, which is seemingly normal, kind of feminine, but that's cool, and we hook up. I ended up falling asleep there and woke up at around 10 a.m. to the stench of just death. I opened my eyes, feeling very sober, and started to look around the room. I noticed that only girls' clothes were hung in the closet. I start to assume that I've possibly been cheated with, and then I see a giant black binder on his nightstand. When we woke up, I decided to jokingly ask him what's in that giant binder, and turns out it was every single episode of Golden Girls printed out. He said that he read it at work and it's the only show he'll ever watch. Okay, I asked him what he did for work, something I definitely should have known by this point, and he dodged the question. I sat up and looked at the pillow that I'd been cozily sleeping on, and it had no pillowcase and was covered in what looked to be old blood. And it looked like the blood had been coughed onto it. I started putting the unpleasant pieces together, and I asked as sensitively as I could, "Hey, was this your sister's room?" And I noticed the clothes in the closet and whatnot, and he says, "Yeah, and this is her bed. I haven't changed or washed anything, and it makes me feel better to be in her bed. This is actually where I held her when she died, and you remind me so much of her. I really, really like you." And then casually tried to hook up with me like he didn't just drop unsettling news. Now, I did feel immensely sorry for him, but I needed to get out of there. So I made some excuse and I left. I decided to not entirely ghost him because of how bad I felt for him, and he was clearly dealing with some really dark stuff. We kept in contact for a few weeks until I went on my Find My Friends app and noticed that he had clearly taken my phone while I was asleep that night and shared my location with himself. I called him and I went off at this point. This is not my first rodeo with a stalker type, and I was not dealing with it. He told me that he couldn't believe that I thought he would do that, and I'm being a really terrible person dumping him because his cat had recently died. And at that point, I just blocked him. After he said that about his cat, combined with his tendency to hold on to things, it really makes me wonder what that smell actually was. Let's hope that it's not what I think it is. I moved into a 70s-era house with two roommates called D and E last November. Simply put, the house is weird. Weird construction, weird decoration, weird neighbors, just weird vibes all around. As far as I know, it's only belonged to one or two families. Dee's dad bought it in April, and there's never been a death on the property, but regardless, I strongly believe that we're unwillingly sharing it with a third roommate. So, it started around January for me. The first incident was just really jarring as well. I was getting ready to take a shower and listening to music on my Bluetooth speaker, and as I was standing at the mirror, there were 3 loud knocks on the door. I thought that I was home alone, so I turned my music down and yelled Dee's name to see if it was her, as she gets annoyed if we play music too loudly while she's studying or trying to nap. But no one answered. So I checked outside the door, and her dog was laying against it, but I was alone. For reference, this dog barks if he hears a car door slam within a 2-mile radius of here, so it's an actual problem how high-strung he is, yet he hadn't even noticed what had just happened. I immediately decided that this place was haunted at this point, and my music had upset someone, or I was having a mental breakdown and hallucinating, or something like that. But it slowly became more apparent that we were dealing with something here. Things started falling off kitchen counters at random while we were just sitting in the living room. The dog's tennis balls would just roll across the floor in front of us, and there were more random noises, but it was all harmless at this point. In the past couple of weeks, it's all gotten more frequent as well. We're up to unexplainable things happening a few times a day, in fact, all three of us at different times. Eventually, he and I decided to dub our new friend Perry. Anyway, I work weird hours and I'm usually off around 1 to 3 a.m, but I mostly just want to sit on the couch and watch TV when I get home, so I'm alone at night a lot and experience the brunt of things. I feel like I'm being watched all the time, which I've learned to deal with. I hear things fall off the tables and counters and then proceed to roll around on the floor, and I just kind of ignore it. I get very, very bad feelings if I look into mine and Dee's bathroom in the dark, and I see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, and sometimes I'll see a figure that disappears after a split second. I've never felt unsafe, though, as I try to be mindful and think of our household guest as a separate person who wants its space, respected like any other person. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as he lets me watch Futurama in peace, then I'm fine. But today in particular, he's been really rowdy. I've been keeping track, and since I got home at 7:30 p.m, 5 separate objects have been knocked off the kitchen counter. The dog began barking at nothing and absolutely wouldn't stop for around 10 minutes 2 hours ago. But the thing that worries me is that E was actually scratched this morning. I've been scratched by something once before, and it was in an extremely haunted abandoned prison in an area known for having really aggressive experiences, so this really freaks me out. He showed me the marks on his arm, and they were really weird as well. 4 thin straight lines from his wrist to the middle of his forearm, and definitely not something that he could have done himself without realizing. I mean, they kind of look like cat scratches. Either way, I'm worried that things are going to keep escalating to the point that I no longer feel safe by myself in this house. I don't mind sharing my space with a paranormal friend, but now that he's starting to get violent, I would really appreciate some ideas on how to handle this. Apparently burning sage is a pretty aggressive tactic. I'll try to do that last if I can. No one ever believed these kind of situations 17 years ago, and it was disheartening back then and even now. I'm 31 now, but was a teen when I was walking home one sunny day. It was winter, but winter in Florida is just a nice cool breeze. I remember holding a Tupperware in my hand that was still hot, containing pasta and broccoli my grandma had just made. It was really cool living 1 block away from my grandma because a quick 10-minute walk meant that I got some really good leftovers. In between my house and her house was a patch of woods, but thorns and ticks prevented me from taking a shortcut through there. Now, I remember looking down at the sidewalk just as I reached the middle of the patch of woods to my right. I heard someone ask, "Hey, where are you going?" and I looked up and to my left, towards the road, and a thin man in a white van with his window rolled down smiled at me. He was driving the opposite direction of the way I was walking, and I simply said home and continued to walk. He started to say, "Hey," over and over again, so I looked back to see him hanging out of the driver's side window. And then he says, "I'll give you a ride home, come here." I kept walking though, and I loudly said, "No thanks," and I stopped and turned around when I heard him drive away. I began walking again, creeped out, wishing that the woods didn't run so long next to the sidewalk, and I remember wishing I was home already. I was super alert at this point now, hearing every critter in the bush to my right rustling leaves and scurrying about. I pick up my pace, reminding myself that those woods were packed with lizards. I even said it to myself out aloud. It's just lizards running about, silly, but then I hear a vehicle coming up behind me. Out of fear, I look back, and to my horror, it's the same white van with the man still smiling. The van slows down next to me, and a big, huge, angry-looking man flung open the side door and jumped out. I turned to my right and began running as fast as I could into the woods. I was jumping over bushes and long vines, clenching my grandma's Tupperware for dear life, and I looked back once and the thick brush of the woods was actually slowing the big man down. I knew just going straight that I would reach my backyard guarded by a chain-link fence. I remember the thorns and the sticks slicing my skin, but I couldn't feel the pain. I just kept thinking, run. Once I reached the fence, I chucked the Tupperware and hoisted myself over, ripping my jeans and face planted on the ground on the other side with a loud thud. I ran onto my porch and began banging the back door. My dad lets me in, and I'm literally panicking, covered in dirt and cuts, trying to lock the back door. I felt safe to be back home with my dad and our Rottweilers, and he sat me down and started questioning me and immediately called the cops. The cops arrived, only two, and took a report, and they said that nothing like that had happened in my area before, and one even told me that lying for attention was against the law. I remember they left, and my dad swore that he believed me, that I could sleep in his room that night if I wanted, and I remember feeling really sad and frustrated about not being believed and going to bed without even eating the pasta with broccoli. It was hard to sleep or go anywhere for months after that because, well, I was scared. I was scared that the man was still out there. My dad ended up getting me a cell phone and installing an alarm system to help me feel safe. But, unfortunately, I still have issues being alone to this day. My parents decided that we were going on a trip down to Tasmania when I was 15, and I stayed with my grandparents. Whilst they were gone, I had this really weird dream where I was flying around and quite happy, and eventually I landed in front of an old house and walked up the stairs and went inside. When I got in, a small girl was in front of me, and she was wearing a cream-coloured long-sleeve dress, black stockings, shoes, and a bonnet. She looked happy to see me. She told me that she'd been waiting for me, and she was lonely, and her name was Annabel. I asked where her mum and dad were, and her face just turned really sad, and she grabbed my hand and led me down the hallway to, I guess, an outhouse or something, and slowly pushed open the door. I didn't really see anything, but I got a feeling of her mum and dad died, and she told me that they all got sick. I felt myself floating again, and Annabel got upset and started crying, asking me not to leave. I woke up, and I didn't really think a lot about it, apart from that it was strange and that I could remember all the details. The next night, I'm about to go to sleep, and in my ear, I hear Annabel's voice say my name. It obviously freaked me out a bit, but I eventually fell asleep with the lights on. So, my parents returned from their holiday, and before they can say anything, I ask if they bought a house, and they both look at me dumbfounded and ask how I knew. I had a sense and ask if they have pictures of the house, and the house is exactly the same as the one in my dream. My mum makes me sketch the layout and says that it's the same apart from the back room, but the house is 100 years old. I tell her that it's not empty, and I tell her about Annabel. My mum has her own stories at this point, and so she believes me, and a year after they move in, I finish school and move down. At first, I dream of Annabel and we're happy, just hanging out. Every time I dream of her, my dad is woken up by the sounds of things rustling around in the house. Then, Annabel starts making herself known. We hear whispering and footsteps, and no one's too freaked out at this point. The first night in my new place, I was living with a friend, and we were watching telly when the lights flicker, and we both look at each other, and I'm about to say, "That's weird," and then every cupboard door and room door in the entire house just flies open with force. We just grabbed each other and sat there frozen for quite some time, and neither of us really slept that night. A few nights go by without incident, and I'm dreaming again, and I'm somewhere pitch black, and I see Annabel, and I go to say hi, but her face is different. It's angry and deformed, and she's standing a few meters from me when she lunges and grabs my nightdress and starts shaking me with force, growling and screaming in my face that I left her. I wake up terrified and throw my light on, and everything in my room is overturned, like I'd been robbed or something. I can't move and I can't speak, so I sit there for hours with my light on until daytime. I eventually get out of bed and go to the kitchen, and my friend is sitting at the table, and I ask her as normally as I can how her night was, and she tells me that she didn't sleep a wink because of the rustling of plastic bags, but every time she tried to find the noise, she just couldn't. I break down at this point, and I tell her about Annabel and show her my room, and that night I decided to apologize to Annabel out loud and tell her why I left. My parents were getting divorced, and years go by and nothing happens, and then I have my daughter, Jasmine. Jasmine was around 3 and playing in her room, and I went to go and check on her, and she was mumble singing kind of, and just talking to herself when I peeked around the corner, and she had a bonnet on her head. I'd never bought one and never got one gifted, and she turned and looked at me, and I just went rigid because it was my daughter, but she looked different, and said, "Mummy, why didn't you call me Annabel?" At this point, I pulled the bonnet off of her head, scooped her up, and I gave it to her dad, went outside, and I just torched it. I don't know if it was out of fear or anger or confusion or frustration, but that day I threatened Annabel that if she ever come near me or my child again, that I'd send her away forever. And it's been 8 years, and I haven't seen or heard anything again. Oh, and by the way, my grandmother did some research on the house and did in fact find out that a little girl and her family and all the members of the house, they died in there because of measles or something. Let me begin by saying that I'm female, and this happened when I was about 13 years old. My family is really strict and never let me or my siblings spend the night over anyone's house. However, the day that the incident took place, I'd begged my parents for nearly an hour to allow me to spend the night over at my cousin's house. Finally, they got so agitated that they just agreed to let me stay the night at my cousin's house. So my aunt and uncle were kind of hands-free parents, so they pretty much let us do whatever we wanted, no questions asked. My cousin and I decided that we wanted to get some shawarmas from a restaurant down the street. It was about a 10-minute walk, and it wasn't that late out, but it was a cold Michigan winter night, so it got dark pretty early. We left the house at 6 p.m, but it felt much later than that due to the darkness outside. We got to the restaurant just fine, bought a couple of sandwiches each, and decided to eat them on the walk back to her house. Now, although her house was close to the restaurant, we were a little freaked out from the darkness and agreed that it would be best to take a shortcut back to her house. The shortcut meant that we had to walk through an alley behind a bunch of businesses nearby. Before we entered the alley, we looked down the alley to see if anyone was there, and we didn't see anyone, so we felt that it would be fine if we went ahead and just walked down the alley. We were walking at a leisurely pace, just enjoying our sandwiches, and suddenly we heard a couple of boys call from behind us. It was a loud, "Hey you," and we tried to act cool and just kept walking, but they started shouting louder, so we turned around to see if they were talking to us or somebody else. There were at least 4 teenage boys calling at us, and they started running towards us, yelling that they were going to mess us up. We got really scared, obviously, so we threw our food on the floor and we just ran as fast as we could. But being that they were much older than us and much faster, they started gaining up on us really fast, and finally one of the boys reached us. He stretched his arm out and grabbed me by the hair, and I started screaming and begged him not to hurt me. His friends caught up to me and started laughing, and my cousin kept running and was crying hysterically. I was begging them not to hurt me, and I was crying really hard at this point. They said that they were going to make me pay for running away and not responding the first time they called us. They were dragging me down the alley in the opposite direction of my cousin's house, and I was sobbing the entire time, and about 10 minutes had passed when one of the boys said that we were almost at his house and I was really going to pay for my actions. And just then, a van horn started blaring. It was as if someone just laid their hand down on the horn and wouldn't take it off. The van was coming right towards us, and as soon as it got in front of us, the van stopped and out jumped my 7 male cousins. My cousin was the only girl in the family and the youngest of 8 children, while my female cousin sat in the van crying. One of them grabbed me and threw me into the van, and they beat the ever-living crap out of the boys who had been messing with me. It was a close call that night, and since then, I've never walked down that alleyway again.